Hello, LinkedIn, and welcome to, Makers and Movers continuation. So very pleased, as you are, I hope, by now used to. We do a couple of live sessions to take on questions and to take on your, to dwell a little bit deeper into some of the topics from the Makers and Movers Summit that happened last week. And today's panel will be discussing more on how to achieve supply chain fitness. And it's a kind of a continuation from the panel as well as the keynote presentation that Heiner Merman did on the summit. So before we deep down, we go into the questions, let me briefly introduce the panel. So I'll start with Heiner. He is the Chief Executive Officer at Orkestra SCS. Orkestra is a cloud-based platform which is up and coming, very much leading the way into big data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to integrate your logistics ecosystem into a platform that gives you real-time visibility. And Heiner has more than 20 years of experience in global logistics across Americas, Europe, Asia. Prior to Orkestra, he has spent most of his career at DB Schenker, where he was all the way to member of the board for air and ocean freight. So Heiner, welcome once again. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Radu.
Then we have Ansgar Buschmann, who is currently holding the position of supply chain management for DBW Advanced Fiber Technologies, based out of Germany. DBW is a global developer and manufacturer of high-quality fiber and metal products for the automotive industry. Ansgar, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Pleasure for me.
And then we have Dr. Stefan Getztetter, who is the partner and associate director for supply chain at Boston Consulting Group, BCG, one of the leading supply chain consulting firms in the world. Within BCG, he led the development of the SCM iLab, which is the format to demonstrate digital SCM solutions live, as well as he serves as an adjunct professor at the MIT Global Scale Network. Stefan, welcome and thanks for joining.
Thanks, Radu. Thanks a lot.
Super. So let's start maybe with the question that a lot of people liked your presentation, Heiner. You spoke a lot about supply chain fitness. Maybe let's start with you, Heiner, and what are some of the KPIs, and then we'll go around and we'll hopefully have a great conversation. What are some of the KPIs through which you measure supply chain fitness?
Thanks, Radu. I mean, logistics KPIs and supply chain KPIs are extensive. There's no doubt. And what to look at really depends very, very much on the development stage of a shipper. If you start out and you have virtually no visibility on performance and you have no KPIs in place, I would suggest to start with KPIs that impact your customers. On-time performance, delivery in full, and so forth. And once you've got that in place, start by selecting a couple of relevant KPIs for the various functions. Look at what is your capacity utilization in the warehouses, what's your utilization of containers, what are some of the cost KPIs in terms of how much is it costing you to operate a warehouse. Look at some performance. How are your suppliers performing? How are your forwarders performing? Is the real-time performance of the carriers, is it as promised, and so forth? But start slowly and then get into it deeper as you gain more experience, more capability.
Ansgar, you're the client, right? So
yes, so we are using the Orkestra platform and we have some KPIs, but let me say, before it comes to a KPI, it's the utmost important to define a standard. Without a standard, you cannot measure, and without measurement, you have no KPI. This is one of the comment, and it's important that you really work with the KPIs. So if you measure the weight of a pig every day, this gives not the pig more fat. So really, if you define a KPI, you must really work with it. And we have some alert system with the Orkestra platform, and we have only few, but we work with it. Otherwise, it will not work.
fully agree.
Stefan, you see a lot. You.
Yeah. No, obviously, I agree with everything the colleagues say. Maybe let me add one angle to it, because I think KPIs are super important and need to be measured, and all that is true. The only downside of a single KPI is that it, per definition, very often measures the performance of a certain function, let's say. Not every KPI, but many. So therefore, the KPI target setting sometimes I think is underestimated, because the targets for each single KPI need to be aligned in a way that we have a seamless end-to-end optimization and not, let's say, an isolated functional optimization. So the KPIs are the foundation. What I see quite often in companies where they struggle is to find the best target values, because as we all know, in supply chain, it's all about trade-offs. So you cannot be perfect in every single KPI, and finding the best balance between the KPIs end to end. That's, I think, where many companies struggle, and where obviously end-to-end systems can ultimately help to balance it out and to find the best target values.
I actually want to bring an example of a large retailer, and he's also a producer of fashion goods and sports goods, and the head of logistics, international logistics purchasing. He was saying that in terms of the KPIs for purchasing of goods and the cost to serve and all of that, he had some, but then he had to convince his management that, don't look at that as compared to last year, because obviously there's a big change in terms of what is happening on the market. So another angle is making sure that you're measuring and benchmarking with the correct benchmark for the appropriate time, because a container now, it costs X. Last year it would have cost, 1/3 or 1/5 of that cost, right? So how do you also evolve this, right, as compared to how the market and the economic situation, I guess, evolves? I'll just open it up. Maybe you have some thoughts on that angle as well.
Yeah, so maybe I can start. For us, it's not that important to have a KPI on cost of container, because this is something that we cannot influence. Of course, so when we know it's good to have it, because when we know we pay too much compared to the market, it's not that good, and we need to act on it. But this is not what I define as a KPI. Also, when we have the KPI, the transport time from a container from Europe to America, now we see that the lead time is increasing, but we have no influence. So for me, the KPI is not the transportation lead time. The KPI is the goodness, how good we are able to load the container, so container utilization, and to have a pulse, a trigger when the container is loaded. So this is something we can influence, and if we put the wrong part into a container, so it's not the long lead time that drives our customers mad. It's wrong measurement or wrong behavior when loading the container. And this is something that I think is underestimated, that you really need to have a good overview, a good platform to have the correct pulse when loading a container, for example.
On just before Heiner or Dr. Stefan answers, we have actually this. Not this one. Sorry, this question. Okay, so it kind of works very well with what Ansgar is saying, right? So, what are some of the critical success factors to consider so that you make sure that you set the right KPI, measuring the right thing, and not something that is basically not solving the underlying problems, which remain there, right? So I guess how to make sure you're measuring the right thing as well is another aspect. And Heiner, maybe to Orkestra also, if you can link it to some examples where you help clients, right? Maybe you have one specific case that you can show or share more.
So as I said earlier, we usually start, but obviously don't end, and with customer KPIs, and starting to ask the question, how long and how accurate does it take your customer service team to answer your customer queries, and are you able even to give them satisfactory answers? So this is one thing. So you can measure that. You can measure that lead time, and you can measure the accuracy. Another topic is of course on-time performance. But there, as Ansgar says, this is very, very difficult to really compare right now. And then you have a series of inventory-related KPIs that are very, very relevant and are really a measure of how much capital you need to tie up in your supply chain. And we look at those pretty accurately. And from there, you can branch into relatively sophisticated landed cost models that drive out further KPIs. The trick, from my experience, start at a reasonable spot, sophisticated, and get more ambitious as you go forward.
I like the question very much, because I think when we are looking at a certain KPI, we really need to be relentless in asking what is making up this KPI. And Heiner, you mentioned OTIF, for example, at the beginning, and I think that's a fantastic KPI to drill down into the entire operations and understand what are the root causes for good or bad performance of this KPI. And especially here, when we design KPI trees for our clients, we go down to the PI level, 1, 2, 3 levels down. And then, I mean, you are surprised how many influences you can find that ultimately affect OTIF, especially so when it comes to goods are not ready, that can go all the way into manufacturing. It can go into the way of logistics service providers, which simply don't show up in time. It can be 100 reasons, and this relentless asking for what are root causes and what else do I have to measure in order to find the best hook to improve the performance. That's really making a difference in supply chain performance.
Maybe Stefan, I'll stay with you because again, from a BCG perspective, you end up working with so many different clients. I'll tweak the question. What is the number one mistake you see them do when they set this KPIs? What is there a consistent pattern where they screw it up basically and they measure the wrong thing?
Yeah, I would say the number one mistake is having too many KPIs in place. Companies seem to think that the K is a letter, but is not really standing for key. So they end up having 73 key performance indicators, which is a contradiction in itself. So I think a very good breakdown of very few KPIs into PIs and then making the connections of them. That's the art and the science in itself, let's say. So not getting lost in details on level 1, but having a clear 4, 5, maximum 6 really KPIs which you monitor, and then having meaningful drill downs and root cause analysis in place to have a more functional PI breakdown. That would be my observation.
I'll pull this question. So Koala is asking, best practice sharing that Orkestra can highlight on end-to-end supply chain transformation, starting from people to the processes. So I won't pass it to you, Heiner. I'll pass it to you, Ansgar. Better hear it from the client mouth. No pressure.
Okay, so then let me start, so then Heiner can correct me or add something if I miss something. So when it comes to Orkestra, it's all about setting up the process. So this is very much people-minded. So from my perspective, so Orkestra has the correct people. No, I'm back. So sorry, and has the correct people knowledge and the right attitude to listen to the customer, and then to set up the correct platform. And for the processes, so especially for DBW, So this was really a transforming process from a manual Excel-based offline measurement with a lot of mistake and different data to a end-to-end digitized process with 100% visibility and transparency. So this was really the value added that the Orkestra brought to other business when it comes to long-term shipments from Europe to US. So we really appreciated and benefited much from the Orkestra platform and the Orkestra system.
If I may add, Radu, is what we and this I think probably applies to most situations for pretty much anyone. I think it's important before you deploy a tool to really understand the organization holistically and speak with the people, see what their starting point is, and then deploy the right technology that people can actually adopt and start building on success. We have no interest to drop in our platform and then have a bad experience because people are not ready to use it and won't get the desired benefit. So it's absolutely key to really to start out and understand the organization.
Could I add to this because I find it interesting over the past, let's maybe say 10 years, there has been the gradual shift to cloud-based platforms, which is now obviously the norm. And I think there's one element which is probably a bit overlooked. So when it was on-premise and when there was a lot of customization going on, it truly was that the organization not necessarily had to change so much in order to apply this piece of software because the software was adapted to the organization quite big time. Now, this is not possible to this extent. It is, configuration still goes on in cloud-based platforms, but there's not so much customization going on. And that in turn automatically means that the organization necessarily has to transform their ways of working, has to change to some extent for good. I would say it's not a bad thing. But then that automatically means a system implementation is not at all a system implementation anymore. It's really nearly always a transformation that goes on. And the things on the people side, it goes without saying that this is the most important point to address the people side and what's in it for them. Why do they need to change? Why is it good to change? And these questions, because there's no traditional system implementation going on anymore with cloud-based systems.
That's a good point.
I want to stay a little bit longer on the people side, because usually in conferences there's a lot of talk about the technologies, but ultimately it's the people that make or break it, and or buy into it or don't buy into it, and then the best technology is not really useful if the people are not using it, right? So I guess let's open up a little bit of discussion also to the angle, how do you make sure that buy-in is there, right? Heiner, Ansgar, Stefan, what are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the things that work, right? Because again, it's that Stefan, you mentioned it, right? Why do we need to change, right? So maybe let's go a little bit in that direction and see how do we get the people on the journey, I guess is the question. How do we get them to buy into the technology? Who wants to start?
Yeah, so
maybe
I come back to last week what Pavan Yoshi was saying. So he was saying, make sure that you have the people who change the direction. So this is a key issue. So you have the KPIs, but you really need to understand what is the KPI saying, and you need to change the direction. You need to act if something is going wrong. And this is especially for the platform when you establish the platform. So at the beginning, so we had a lot of hiccups because now the data was there, but we have spent a lot of time to interpret the data and to have a match that the data is there. So you need people who are checking that the data is correct, and so while this was done, this was also a learning for us all to see when is which information coming, and who is really supporting, and who is not supporting. So of course, so we found out that we have some people in our organization who are not that optimistic and not that supporting at the beginning, and this is also some point where we have to push the people, and if this is not working, sometimes you have to change the people to achieve the goal at the end. This is important.
And you get early on when you start a project, and Stefan would see this every day. And if you start a project, you get to know the people relatively quickly through the questions they ask and to the level of enthusiasm they have. And then, if, as Ansgar says, the ones that work against progress and against transformation, maybe the future is in an organization is limited there. I mean, there's unfortunately sometimes no way around it, but the people part and the change management part is absolutely essential.
Yeah, and let's say the mental model that we are using in our programs when it comes to change management is so. We first of all assume the positive side, that nobody is acting, let's say, with a bad intent. Huh? So what we are looking at is three steps. The first one is what's the context they are acting in, and then this context usually leads to some behaviors, and those behaviors, obviously, the sum of the behaviors make up the performance. Huh? And now, I think it's always very interesting and very necessary to understand, why do people behave like they behave? And the generic answer is it's because of their context. Huh? So we are asking them to behave in a certain sense, and maybe we haven't done a good job to change the context to enable them to behave in a different way in order to drive more performance. And I think where I feel, or where I see companies failing in transformations, is they are either not addressing the context enough, and that can be capability builds, that can be explaining, that can be the KPI target values, which are contradicting, and so on. So that's all the context. And therefore, we are expecting a behavioral change out of the blue, which will not happen if we are not working on the context. And therefore, then we are not getting the performance out of the whole thing. So looking at those three elements holistically and comprehensively, let's say deep enough to be taken seriously, I think that's the main driver for performance enhancement. And then the system is the enabler. Without the system, obviously, it will not work. But then without this change aspect, also the system cannot drive performance because it will ultimately fail.
Maybe let's. I'll probe you for an example. I'll double click on this for an example, Stefan. But before I do that, and I give you a little bit of time to think, I remember this client that came to us. They were doing a data cleaning project, and whilst they were doing this data cleaning, setting up data lakes, and they were asking us to help them recruit some data scientists. And the head of the regional head of operations who was in charge says, look, as we were looking through the data, we found that we have a client called Mickey Mouse. We also have Winnie, like all sorts of data depending on the country. And he's like, this is insane. It's like, so just that process, because people were not really, depending on the country, they were just filling it up for the sake of filling it up, right? So that's where, back to you, Stefan, okay, this process, and you mentioned context, right? So maybe you can think of one example, right, where it worked. What happened? You don't need to mention necessarily the client name, but just to go one level deeper.
Yeah. No, I think the best example in every transformation is really the question: how do we come from a functional supply chain view to an end-to-end supply chain view? And I think the context very often in many companies is still set to be functional. So there is a target to the to the inventory planner, you are responsible for driving down the inventories. And then there is a requirement from commercial. You are here to give me products, so please have enough inventory in place to serve our customers. And then there is the manufacturing guys who want effective manufacturing, large batches, and then leading to high inventories and so on. So all what we all know, the contradicting interests in the supply chain. And that's the context where most of the supply chain people are working in. And if we then implement an end-to-end platform into this context and hope that suddenly the behavior of the people will change. So as a miracle, they suddenly will collaborate and will all pull in the same direction and do everything to please the clients. That will not happen, because still the inventory planner is asked to drive down inventory as hell. And nothing has changed for him or her. Huh? So the first step is to make a functional, or to induce a flow orientation into the supply chain rather than a functional orientation. And then having those people working together and giving them the opportunity to work together, change KPI targets and repeating it over and over again, but then also install routines to make them work together, maybe even co-locate them where possible, business dependent, obviously, having them speaking to each other, having change interventions with them, and so on. So that is gradually changing the context to allow the people to change their behavior. And that we see over and over again. And I think my top topic in this respect would be changing from a functional to a flow supply chain. And that's obviously what all those platforms also want to achieve ultimately.
Where we've had significant success in terms of shortening the change management cycle is with companies that are owned by private equity, because they're on an ownership level as well as on a management level. Everyone is highly motivated to move things forward swiftly and quickly, and the discussion and bringing on people on board is really shortened, because if people don't get on board, they're off the boat pretty fast, you know, and that's also, if you look at Ansgar's company, there he and the top management are very, very interested to transform their supply chain, and the people working within the organization understand that, and they're moving the agenda forward quite swiftly too, I would say.
And what is important is that you have not a single target, so that you have as a team a target or a KPI. This is important. And because then you can avoid what Stefan was saying, that you have different departments with contradictory targets and activities. So in my past career, so I participated conference calls where one was saying you need to drive down your stock, and the next one you need to increase your stock because we need to offer more parts to the market. So this was just 30 minutes, one after the other, and this was showing. And this was not a private equity owned, so this was a multinational company. And but this is strange. And if you build the targets as a team, and you are talking to each other, so then you can achieve good results.
Yeah, I like your point, because, and I also like the drive that PE companies bring into organizations. I think one thing that we need to think about at least is how much of resources with experience can we afford to get rid of, huh? And here, yes, in PE environments, the more it's super demanding, and therefore the more high performers tend to stay, and the lower performance probably don't. But low performing doesn't mean not having experience, huh? So there also needs to be a way to find a home for those people, I would say, and then as I said, change the context in a way that also they can perform in a decent way. So I think there's a bit, with talent scarcity, with not finding enough people to do the work, of course, automation can counterbalance this a little bit. But so I agree with your point, but I think there's a residual caveat to understand what can we do with respect to scarcity of skilled people in the market. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really the people who drive the business. Correct.
I'll pull this question from Felicia. Organization heavily reliant on technological infrastructure for real-time information, also with supply chain consisting of multiple players along the chain. How can the players up their game in this environment, especially with limited resources? So I guess this kind of falls down the path of end-to-end visibility in one angle. So Heino, maybe you want to take this?
Sure. Happy to, Radu. If you look at, and we had another question in terms of what is sort of how do you realize real-time visibility, which goes kind of hand in hand there. So real-time visibility you could achieve for the last 10 years. You simply had to embed a GPS device on a container or on a shipment, and you had it. But many of the shippers sort of resisted the additional expense, and it didn't sort of drive enough value. But in terms of gaining visibility by connecting the key partners of your ecosystem, you can achieve significant value beyond what is the status of my shipment. The status of my shipment is one thing, but to understand how a shipment impacts your overall promise and commitments to the customers. If, as Ansgar has told us in the past, if a container is late, I only care about it if it has an impact on my commitments to my customers, and he's absolutely correct. So having visibility in a single source of truth and get everyone, the whole team, talking about the same thing based on facts and realities is enormously valuable. It requires work, but it's very, very, very extremely valuable.
Yeah. So the only resource that is limited is the time, and therefore it's utmost important to spend the time most efficient. And this we are doing with the Orkestra platform, because in the past, so we had many discussions at the beginning. So we talked about, this is my data, this is your data, what is missing, what is in between, this you have not considered. There's one stock in transit, and is the quantity 100 or 200? So we talked a lot about this, and Sana said, so now we have a single source of truth, and this is now accepted by everyone, and we have proved that the data is correct. And I say, if the data is not in the platform, it's not existing, full stop. And this really saves time because it's working. We have now, after a while, very, very good online performance. And this is really helpful for us in a daily business and extremely saves us time.
If I can add, it requires work to set up, though, and we did this work together and Sky in this case, and with other customers as well. And it's not like you can drop in a solution and it works out of the box. It requires a concentrated and concerted effort to make it happen, and it's worth it.
It's not a plug and play version, correct?
And are you seeing, Stefan, I'll ask you also, many discussions, COVID-19 acceleration of digital solutions, mouthful, buzzwords flying around, but it is true that things that maybe took 5 years to do, or I don't know, 1 year to do now were done in a couple of months or in a couple of weeks, right? Are you seeing that? Is it likely to continue? How's this adoption of this digital platforms, visibility platforms, one source of truth type of solutions from your view?
I think that there are no two opinions that this is going to continue. And I think the effect that we have seen most often in companies is that COVID had forced them to be super agile in the supply chain, and most of the companies have succeeded to do so. So they have been together, they had task forces all over the place and managed their end-to-end supply chain and somehow made the best out of the bad situation, let's say. And ultimately they liked it because they thought, wow, now we have really achieved something because we have navigated through those difficult times. The downside that they had suffered from is it was a huge amount of work. So the task forces very often went into the night and sometimes even on the weekend, and endless meetings because they didn't have the data in place. They weren't able to play through scenarios at short time, make value-driven decisions and all that. So what they now want, most of the companies, is let's continue to work in this collaborative fashion as we did in our night pizza task force meetings, let's say, but let's now do it during normal working hours with the right tools in place. So now there's a bit of a retrofitting of many supply chains to get the tools in place to do what they did in COVID without this immense effort of human time and data crunching and all that manually.
No.
And to kind of draw this to an end, I'm also curious, right, from a CEO perspective, Ansgar, you will be put on the spot. You can't talk badly about your CEO, that for sure. But I'm curious also from a C level, from a CEO level, right? Are you seeing, Heiner, Stefan, are you seeing more recognition? I've heard that we did the summit last week, right? And one of the terms was supply chain came out from the basement. I think maybe it's a little bit exaggerated, but for some companies it is the situation, or it was the situation. Are you seeing that trend that CEOs are like, okay, I really need to focus on supply chain. Supply chain is a unique selling proposition. Potentially, it's a significant risk. How is that scenario playing out? Ansgar, let's start with you since I put you on the spot. Or Heiner, if you.
Yeah. So from my perspective, supply chain. I'm not sure if maybe Stefan can of course elaborate and has maybe a different view. I think supply chain was never per se in the basement. It was in part seen as a competitive differentiator, but in my view, not in the basement in sort of moderate to high performing companies. But now they see supply chain and the disruption of supply chain is something that becomes an enterprise topic. It's not just the people working in supply chains that have to deal with the topic, but others and C-level, CEO, and CFO in many companies are contributing and really owning also the result, which is cool for people in supply chain, important, you know. And I just saw an interesting article actually over the weekend, and Toyota. There's a huge shortage of chips that affect the automotive industry in very, very real and bizarre ways, or unforeseen ways. And Toyota, because they had to live through this tsunami, were prepared because they were able to set up much more thought out contingency systems, and apparently their production is not affected by the current microchip shortage at all. So it's another testament that this event or big event has an impact on the company's agenda, and I suspect COVID will as well.
Oh, yes, I agree. And supply chain in the past was only recognized on CEO level when it comes to some expedite shipments, means air freight or costly hand carry shipments. And this is, of course, a negative image. And I think now it's more important to show and prove to our customers that we are running a most effective supply chain and logistic with low level cost, full transparency and full visibility, and that we are able to react as fast as our customer are requiring that. And this is now coming on the agenda.
Yeah, and also I think we must not forget that let's say the functional description of supply chain is not as old as manufacturing or procurement or so. And then I think there has in some companies, or maybe even many companies, been a bit of a confusion between supply chain and logistics. And those companies who think that supply chain is a bit of an evolvement of logistics, they obviously struggle to position the function correctly. But those companies who understand that supply chain is an orchestrating function, and by the way, it's not at all an operational function. Maybe logistics is the operational arm, a little bit of supply chain management, but supply chain management and as its whole, it's not an operational function, it's an orchestrating function. And many of the core processes, which are facilitated very often by supply chain people, especially the integrated business planning, or sometimes still referred to as S&OP, sales and operations planning, those are end-to-end business processes. They are no operational processes, and they help executives to steer their business, not more and not less. So and companies who have understood this, that executives regularly should sit in IBP meetings to steer their business, they understand that supply chain is not an operational basement function.
Well, on that note, fingers crossed it stays like that. I think it's only going in the right direction. We are actually right now close to publishing an article with the World Economic Forum with the title "Why CEOs and Chief Supply Chain Officers Make Great CEOs." So Ansgar, hopefully very soon, you're going to the C-suite. But it is true, right? So and for the reasons that Stefan mentioned, IBP is getting more and more consideration. Even that, as you rightfully said, S&OP is still referred to, and certain companies don't have it in place, but it is happening. So. And hopefully with more solutions like and more happy clients of Orkestra, then there are more success stories, and then more will do it. So on that note, thank you very much for your time, for the great examples, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.